Before we get too involved, I really wanted to take an opportunity to say thank you to Rio and the Salazar Center and to the university for this opportunity. And really, since our new president is here, she's not going to say anything, but I wanted to make sure everybody knew Dr. Cheryl Lovell, the new interim president of Adams State University, is here. And maybe even more importantly, my dad is here. And my sister, but so this is really rather intimidating. This is more intimidating than speaking at a commencement address because I know most of the people in the room, so the pressure's on. Look, this is really titled a Tale of Two River Basins, the South Platte and the Rio Grande. And this came about as a result of a conference Reagan and I were both at CU earlier this year. And I didn't have a real appreciation for all the history of the South Platte, and realized as Reagan was giving his talk that there are a lot of parallels, a lot of similarities, and thought it would be interesting to have this kind of conversation here. So I think how we'll structure this is we'll certainly outline the similarities between the Rio Grande and its history and the South Platte and its history, but at some point there's a divergence that the South Platte goes one direction and the Rio Grande chooses to go another. And then we'll talk about those differences, and then for me it'll be kind of the outcomes and where we're headed with the different path that the Rio Grande chose to proceed. So I truly appreciate Reagan taking the time to come here. I know his plate is really full, but it's a pleasure to be here with Reagan and have him speak and talk about the history and the challenges on the South Platte. So guess we're ready.
I'm on.
Here we go.
Well, good evening, all of you all. It's great. Thanks, Cleve. Appreciate it. Rio, thanks to you. Thanks to the Salazar Center for hosting us tonight. I love coming to the San Luis Valley. It's really great to get off the Front Range and to be down in this part of the world. I love talking about water. So here we are in the valley talking about, of all things, water. And I've had the really just fantastic privilege of getting to live in Colorado and work on Colorado water for the 30 years of my career. And I consider myself a student of water, not an expert. There's so much to know. It's so rich, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Cleve today. I would encourage you all, if you want to ask questions, make a comment, or even heckle, that's fine as well. I mean, that'll make it more interesting for me, for certain, if you want to do that. And so if you want to interrupt or say something as we go, I'm good for that. I mean, I'm here for the evening, so however you want to do that. This groundwater thing is playing out globally. All over the world, we're seeing the issues of groundwater conflict coming to bear. I mean, think about it. It's really just since the end of World War II that we began to develop this research source globally, right? I mean, we were using a little bit of groundwater before the war, but post-World War II is when essentially entire civilizations, cities, farming communities, natural resource communities have begun to extract groundwater without a full appreciation for the interplay between surface and groundwater. And yeah, we all knew they were interconnected. We had a sense of that. But the science behind that, the full understanding of how appropriating groundwater affect other resources, whether that be wildlife, wetlands, rivers, lakes, all of the above. The connections were hard to quantify. And so in Colorado, and I think both of our presentations are going to lay out some of this history for you. And you will see how there's some similarities and then divergences. But what I can tell you is really going back to the drought of the mid-50s, the groundwater story really started playing in Colorado, particularly in the Arkansas and the South Platte basins. And that came to smash, as some of you know that are in this room, late 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 2000s in the case of the South Platte. Denver Basin aquifers, in the 80s, that became a big story, right? We realized that we were building a civilization on top of a groundwater resource that was very finite and recharged very slowly, right? And so we had to figure out how is that aquifer going to play. Ogallala aquifer, right? We started really hitting that thing hard in the 1960s. We made some decisions. We never said that was going to be a sustainable aquifer. We said we're going to use it for a certain number of years, and then we'll see what happens. And now, in 2018, farmers and their children and their grandchildren are saying, wait a minute, we want this aquifer to be around for a while. And so now they're starting to, actually they've been doing it for a couple of decades. How are we going to make this aquifer persist? And even in the crystalline granite aquifers in the state of Colorado, this story has played out. Jefferson County is a great example. Exempt wells, we consider them exempt from administration, right? Put one exempt well down a hole, nothing happens, right? What happens when you put 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 exempt wells down there in a small basin? And the science lagged the development, okay? And that's really part of the story here that we're going to tell tonight. So I've invited Cleve, by the way, to interject or heckle me as well. So we'll see if he does. But I'm going to tell you the South Platte story as quickly as I can. It's a long story. We could stay here all night and talk about the South Platte, and I would enjoy doing it, but I'm thinking you all wouldn't. So I'm going to try to be, I'm going to try to move the story along. And let's see if our clicker works, because I'm totally tethered. You can see I'm wired up. I mean, if the clicker doesn't work, up. So this is such a good story that books have been written about the South Platte fight. One was a murder mystery called Water, where people actually got killed over groundwater. Can you imagine that? Yeah, it's a good story. The other, how about this title? The Man Who Thought He Owned Water. That was kind of depressing, right? But actually it's a great book, and they're written about how the South Platte groundwater conflict unfolded. I'm going to tell you just the high points of this story. If I can make Rio, I may have to have a little technology assistance here. Yep, there we go. Okay. Sorry, I hope that's not going to happen every slide, because it's going to be a long night if it does, Rio. I may need some help here. South Platte system is a different system than what you all have. I just want to make that point right. We're talking about an alluvial aquifer, very high transmissivity rates, where water moves fast through that aquifer. Things can happen a little bit quicker here, as you'll see. You're looking at the green actually here are irrigated parcels in the South Platte. So we're talking essentially from Denver down to the state line and the tributaries therein. We're divided into water districts. We're Water Division 1, you're 3, but you can see those colors are the different water districts. I bring that up because that's part of the story as it plays out.
How many irrigated acres are there?
So we're going to get there, Cleve, but at one time, Rio, I think I'm going to need some help here, because that's going to just take forever. Cleve he already saw my slides, you can see. So at one time there was 1.1, 1.2, somewhere in there, million acres of irrigated ground in the South Platte. Today, I think we're probably doing good to be at 800,000 in the basin, okay? Combination of surface and groundwater, less than 20% are groundwater only, about a third are a combination, and over half are surface water only. So this is an important part of the South Platte story. It's a surface water dominated system. When I point and click, that'll mean go forward. But we're just pretending that I'm actually clicking. Okay, go forward again. Just point and click again. Okay, this is a map of the Platte, but what you're looking at there are the major diversions. And from Denver downstream, there's about 53 major irrigation systems. Some of them are huge. And you see those little yellow X's? Those are the dry up points on the river. Those are the points. There's 13 of those on the South Platte, where the river is completely swept. What happens when you go a mile downstream from those dry up points? It's running like a river all over again. Why? What is that? It's groundwater coming back to the system, right? So we'll completely sweep the river. You go just a little ways down and the river's flowing, and the next person is taking their diversion, right? A little further down, they're sweeping the whole river. So this river is a return flow system where surface water and groundwater, it's like a washing machine. It's all mixing up. That's a click. Okay, so I don't know how much Cleve's going to get in this, but way back in the day when this was mainly Native Americans, the South Platte was a losing stream. The stream was charging the aquifer, okay? After the Europeans settled and we began developing these ditches, we were taking the water out of the river, taking it along the terraces and the high line. Irrigation return flows were coming back to the river, and the river changed to a gaining river. In other words, the river is gaining from groundwater all the way down, okay? This is an important part of what happened, because We began developing the surface water resource in 1859 as soon as the gold rush came on. The seniors in the South Platte are 1860s, 1870s water rights, all right? So it's a gaining stream due to all that surface water coming in from outside. Click. Okay. So when you drop a well in there, and this is your background, then we're going to move on out of that part. But when you drop a well in, first, that well is intercepting the water that would be flowing to the stream in an alluvial system, right? You put that well in the ground, water's coming in from the benches, whatever, the well's intercepting. At some point in time, what happens, you get enough wells and they're pulling hard enough, you actually reverse the gradient of the river. And so instead of that river being a gaining stream, all of a sudden that river is a losing stream. Does that make sense? So you put enough holes in the ground, you're pulling enough water that you've changed the system. Well, as you can imagine, that's where surface water users get grumpy, right? When you've changed, that's a click reel. So here's quickly how it played out. I'm watching the time, Cleve, and I'm already way behind. 1886 was our first well in the South Platte. 1893 was our first lawsuit. Didn't take very long, did it? And the fellow downstream said, hey, you're entering my water rights. And then you know what the court said? We think he's right, but we have no way of proving it. So you get no damages awarded. Anyway, so from the period up until the drought of the 30s, there were really not very many wells in the South Platte, about 300. Drought of the 30s, we were out of water on the South Platte, and groundwater was the only game in town. Click.
And these are all
alluvial wells, that's right.
Artesian.
Nope, there's no artesian. It's just a bunch of old rocks that were laid down after the ice ages came through, right? It's just all this alluvium that actually wasn't saturated until irrigation came in and diverted all that water out of the stream. So 40s, rural electrification and turbine pump technology came available, but the 40s were wet. Not much happened. What happened in the 50s? Big drought, right? Drought of 54 to 57 used to be our drought of record in Colorado. We had the technology, we had the shortage, that's really when things took off. And actually, the 50s were where the groundwater squabbles began in the South Platte. But they were just squabbles at that time, okay? People were grumpy, but they weren't super grumpy. 57 established our first groundwater law in Colorado. Basically, it said you had to have a permit to drill a well. Before that, you could just go out and drill a well, right? So you had to have a permit, but that's all. The state engineer had no basis to deny the permit. He would just give it to you. 65, we gave the state engineer the ability to deny the permit, click. And 68 was when things really started to come apart in both the Arkansas and the South Platte. And we had a Supreme Court case called Fellhauer, where the Division II engineer in the Arkansas had gone and shut down a bunch of wells. And because they were injuring surface water holders. But when it went to court in the Fellhauer case, basically what the Supreme Court said to the state engineer was, you got to have some basis for shutting down these wells. You can't just choose wells you want to shut down. You've got to go through a rule-making process. We must be orderly here. The biggest, so for those of you who are water junkies, you know this, everybody else, the 1969 Act was the act that completely reformed Colorado water law. A whole bunch of things happened in that act. We'd need another hour to talk about them. But the interesting thing is, another talk. This was the chance where we tried to integrate surface and groundwater administration in Colorado. In other words, what we tried to do through the 69 Act is say that all groundwater is presumed to be tributary. That is, it's part of the stream system. Groundwater must be administered in priority as we administer water, okay? Remember I said that the early appropriators were 1850s, 60s, 70s? And I said the groundwater was drilled in the 30s, 40s, 50s. So what did that make the groundwater users? Juniors. They were out. If we're going to use a priority system, they were out. Stop. Cease. Click. Okay. The genius of the 1969 Act was this idea of a plan for augmentation. In other words, it created, this is what we do in prior, we say that prior appropriation is the law, but then every year about 40 bills go to the legislature to tweak prior appropriation a little bit. It's a moving thing. And the plan for augmentation, I think, was one of the genius ideas of the 69 Act, which said you can take water out of priority, okay? A junior user can take water out of priority, but that user cannot harm any senior users. They can't harm the stream. So let's do a workaround, right? Let's do a workaround in prior appropriation. And if you have a plan that says you can get into priority by replacing those depletions, we'll give you a pass. You'll have a court-adjudicated augmentation plan. And what happened was in the South Platte, law was passed in '69. They had till '74 to get into a court-approved augmentation plan. Very few users did that. Okay, why? The division engineer, we were trying to make it work, folks. And we came into the '70s, drought was the next, and groundwater was really important. And so what they were doing was using a tool called a substitute water supply permit plan to basically, your augmentation plan would be permitted on a yearly basis through the substitute water supply plan process. And so the Division I engineer was accepting and stamping. And he kept saying to them every year, you need to get through court, but bam, I'm gonna get you through this year. Next year, go to court, okay? Well, the 80s and the 90s were good to us in Colorado. And I see some of you who weren't here then, but some of us were. Click. They were wet. And we had a plan, right? We had this plan for augmentation. But 2002 came. And what happened? The plans all got punched in the face by the drought of 2002, as well as, click, Rio. A couple of things happened. It was the perfect storm of the South Platte. So we had a case, a squabble between neighbors in the Arkansas Basin, a silly squabble, that basically ended up with a Supreme Court ruling that said, state engineer, you can't do these substitute water supply plans indefinitely. They're temporary measures. Stop it. Okay? Bam, right on top of that, the 2002 drought happened. In the South Platte, we had a gentleman's agreement. That's what it was called, where the game was to keep the call off the river, because you have to augment your depletions when the river is under administration or under call. If it's a free river, you have no obligation. In the South Platte, the river used to be free most of the year. There was enough water, okay?
The Rio Grande never experienced.
Right, so different situation here for sure. But in a sense, we were gaming the system because the river mostly wasn't under call. We had these substitute supply plans that were getting it done. They were replacing on average about 5 to 10% of their depletions, okay, that hit the river, okay? And it was presumed that those were the injurious depletions. So it wasn't that we were lying to ourselves. We were just working through wet times and it was all playing pretty good. So when the perfect storm all hit, basically what you're looking at there is a map of the South Platte. The green dots are active high-capacity irrigation wells. The red dots are curtailed wells. So about 4,000 wells got curtailed real fast, okay? So at one time, there was as many as probably 8,500 high-capacity irrigation wells in the South Platte. When Empire Lodge came down, bam, hard fall. State legislature made a quick, the legislators started trying to work with folks and give them a little time, a little bit more time, a little bit more time, and click. About the hard stop was 2006, January 2006. It's over. Red tag on the well if you don't have a court-approved augmentation well. So imagine these folks who had irrigated land, who had the machinery, the equity, the labor, everything was in irrigation, and all of a sudden there was a red tag on their well, okay? And for many of these people, all of their wells or a number of their wells, and a lot of, they had a portfolio of water rights. This was super painful, and we went from that 8,500, by the time it was all said and done, to about 6,000 wells, click Rio, that actually got into play. And the way they got into play were through getting these augmentation plans. And the way in the South Platte, the preferred way, and what you'll see in the South Platte is you'll see ditch shares that have been changed for augmentation plan, reservoir shares that have been changed for augmentation. You'll see augmentation wells. That's an interesting concept, isn't it? And then you'll see augmentation facilities that are based on free river. Grabbing that water when the river's free, not under call, putting it into a pond and recharging it back to the aquifer to take care of those depletions that you were causing. And what that chart is just showing is how much water was pumped in those three water districts that I mentioned. And it peaked in 2002 with the drought of almost 700,000 acre-feet of groundwater pumped in the South Platte alluvial system alone. Crashed down to what? 250,000 acre feet. So that's a big drop. Now you're talking about different hydrology, but you can see what was happening as the adjustments were made in the basin where that kind of a cut occurred. Okay, imagine what that's doing to crop production in the South Platte Basin during those years. Then see the inflection point around 2008 where the line started coming back up. Why was it coming back up? Click. Click again, Rio, what the heck? They were building augmentation ponds all over the South Platte Basin. Any place you could find a recharge pit that was lagged back to the river, right? That's the game, because we're trying to lag this water back to the river so that it hits the river when the river's under call. What happens when you put that water underground? Cleve, can you turn the valve? Can you manage it? No, it's just, the water's just going back. And so what you had to do is you had to have a whole series of ponds. And so groups would come together so that you'd have water lagging back to the river over different times. And what happened in the cases that occurred after 2002 used to be you could go to court and you could have augmentation water for, a quarter, 2/3 of your water, something like that. It was a dogfight, and the municipalities went after the ag producers hard, and the surface water ag producers went after the groundwater producers, and the seniors went after the juniors, okay? Fell apart because everybody was trying to protect their equity, whatever that would be. And so it was rough. Click it again, Rio. Okay, just a couple of things maybe that sets Cleve up. Again, obviously, not all groundwater pumping causes material injury, right? If those depletions are hitting the river when it's not under call, or they're lagged back such that it's a very small amount, not a problem. In our basin, augmentation requirements are based on the consumptive use of groundwater pumped. Okay, consumptive use, right? Not total amount. Keep going, Rio. I'm trying to get to Cleve. Here was the big, so basically, I want to make this point because water in Colorado, really water in the West, is a very cooperative venture. We got people working together on ditches, we got people working together in river basins, a lot of moving pieces to make it happen. And I think that there's more stories of collaboration and working together than there are conflict. But the conflict's really rough. And when the gentleman's agreement fell apart in the South Platte Basin, I've highlighted, so from 82 to 2001, the average number of days in Water District 1 where the river was under call was 55 days a year. So you've only got to repay those depletions, right? When things fell apart, the river actually for a few years was under call all the time like you are now. So all the depletions were considered injurious. And this really juxtaposed that with what was happening to growth on the Front Range at the same time, and where a share of CBT, which is about 7/10 of an acre foot, went up to $30,000 a share. Okay, and figure the Fermi. Okay, so you're gonna grow corn and alfalfa, and try to get augmentation water while cities have got ratepayers buying this water. It didn't work out well for producers to do that. Click, Rio. I'm almost done. This is each one of those little R's is an augmentation pond on the South Platte. There's about 700 of them now. Click again, Rio. I'm going fast. Now I'm really moving. Click again, Rio. I want to hear what Cleve has to say. Click again, Rio. You're doing good. Okay, so while all that was going on, CSU and the Division of Water Resources, we were out there measuring groundwater, trying to see if we could figure out what was going on. These are some hydrographs, but essentially, because we're an alluvial system, it reacted pretty darn quick. Think about it. You shut down wells, start putting water in the ground. What happens to groundwater levels? They go up, right? No surprise, right? And they did go up. They did exactly what we thought they would do. In fact, they went up so high that they started flooding producers out in some areas. We started having basements with water in them. We started having septic systems that failed. Who was surprised, right? Stop pumping and start recharging, and that's what happened. And this became really difficult again. And it's part of what I want to get to here. And I'm just about to wrap up, Cleve. Click. That was a click, Rio. Keep going. I'm moving fast now. Okay. So we make these adjustments usually during some sort of a bad scenario, right? Whether it's the drought of 2002, the drought of 2012, the flood of 2013. You know, that's society really moves when there's chaos and problems, right? It's hard to make these kind of big adjustments when things are going great. This system was out of balance, and if you think about it, really in a period of about a decade, and there was some real pain. There were people who went out of business. There were suicides. There was a lot of trauma. But the system did rebalance itself. Now, there are still communities in the South Platte that have water in their basements that happen to have the unfortunate situation of being upgrading of an augmentation pond. We didn't, so prior to this, the reason I'm telling you this whole story, the legislature passed this crazy bill in 2012 that told me to go study the system and bring them some recommendations. And that was not a fun year of my life. I could say more about that, but I won't. But one of the recommendations I made was the state engineer needs to have some ability to comment upon whether or not an augmentation pond is in a reasonable place. Outside of a subdivision is, downgrading of a subdivision is not a reasonable place to put it. So the point is that, click Rio, you can rebalance these systems. Some systems are more responsive. Obviously the Ogallala, if we want to rebalance that, the kind of cutbacks we're talking about on the Ogallala are probably over 50% of the pumped acres now, maybe 60. It's going to be really painful. In the South Platte, we were able to do this rebalancing where there was temporary pain, some of it forever, came back as folks got their augmentation plans in, and because that's an alluvial system, it bounced back pretty quick. But the story's not over, right? I mean, we don't think that you're going to fix these things once and it's all over and you get to go home. We got to keep turning the valves, monitoring, studying, making sure we're getting it right. Because in the South Platte, what happened is we put all these augmentation plans into place and started flooding basements, right? So now we're trying to turn some more valves there and get this right. And groundwater moves slower than surface water, right? And there's lags in the way these systems are moving. So you can make these changes. They're painful. And what I said, new appropriations have to be evaluated, but so does the appropriateness of recharge. You've got to keep thinking about it. You need data to manage these systems. You can't just figure it out once and say you're done. You got to keep monitoring groundwater. You got to keep monitoring pumping. You got to know what your consumptive use is. The data has to be tracked. It has to be reported. And I think it really needs to be transparent as well. It needs to be where people can see it. And part of what we had to develop in the South Platte were uniform tools where everybody was doing the same thing, doing the same reporting, getting on the same page for measuring consumptive use, depletion accounting, all of those things. So that's another important point. And then my last one, I've already made this, is these adjustments, flexibility. I really think that as we think about this going forward, what we tend to do in Colorado is we lock in the terms and conditions of a decree. And right or wrong, the decree is right. And that's okay, that gives certainty, but the future is uncertain also, right? And what we're seeing in Colorado, hey you all, how many droughts of record have we had since 2000 in this basin? Probably at least 3, right? Droughts of record. And so we've got a system there. There's a lot of things happening. We're shifting to center pivots. We're putting in lined pits up and down the South Platte. I mean, these systems are not static. And so if you lock in a system forever, you're going to have another period of adjustment. Hopefully it won't be as hard as the one before, but we'll see. Thanks a lot for letting me be here. I'm going to give the mic to Cleve. Do you want it, Cleve, or not?
I have a question.
Questions, all right. Yes.
Starting back in your slide
Yes.
show, you had something called a coffin well, and I
Yeah.
have no idea what that is.
I love coffin wells. Thanks for bringing up coffin wells. I wish you all had coffin wells. We had a judge, a water court judge by the name of Coffin. And Coffin made the statement, I can't remember the exact date. I've got stage fright. But it was like around 1960, 57, something like that. He said, it's dark down there. It's mysterious. I think these are non-tributary wells. And he did that for about 500 tributary wells in the South Platte. These are beautiful wells. These are 1,200 gallon a minute alluvial wells that have no replacement requirement. And so they throw off the math in the South Platte, right, when you got all those wells out there. So it's just a crazy anomaly of the South Platte. I'm sorry you don't have them here. They're fine, okay? Sorry, yes?
Do lawns take a lot of water, the manicured lawn?
So this is a really interesting question. And we could spend the night on this question, Cleve. Yes and no. Here's what Denver Water says. Denver Water says that if you look at the total consumptive use of water in Colorado, 7% of the water in Colorado is used in the municipal sector. Of that, 40% is used for outdoor landscaping. Of that, a fraction of that's lawns, it's parks and golf courses and everything else. So what Denver Water says is, okay, West Slope, okay, San Luis Valley, you want to limit our lawns? Have at it. You're going to get 2% of the state's consumptive use out of shutting down all the lawns on the Front Range. And so this is a really interesting argument because, there's been a number of attempts, particularly from Southwest Colorado, saying, you guys need to tighten up on the lawn water use. So I think it depends who you ask. If you look at what's happened in my town, Fort Collins, we've gone from 200 gallons per capita per day to about 150. So we've taken a quarter of our water use out of the picture. We've grown our town using less water than we used before 2002, mainly through landscape changes, not exclusively.
Change the cultural value of like gardens versus lawns.
Well, yeah, I think it's, again, what do we want here? And Denver's point is you're not going to fix Colorado's problems on the backs of lawns, but certain communities, like mine, have grown a lot through conservation. And again, it's a matter of an ethic of conservation versus a mandate. So great question. I didn't mean to make light of it.
Charlie has a question.
Charlie.
So if I want to drill a new well along the South Platte there, what do I have to do?
Okay, this is a ringer question. I can tell, I don't know who this man is, but the reason I'm laughing is because what happened in the South Platte is you saw that map of the red dots, mainly the wells up along the Front Range where people couldn't get adequate, affordable augmentation got curtailed. And we saw some expansion in the lower basin, and that made people so mad when they saw new wells going in there. So, to answer your question, you have to have a well permit and you have to have a plan for augmentation. If you can get that, if you got the lawyering, you got the dollars to get through water court, and you got the water, you can drill a well.
So what would my augmentation plan consist of?
Your augmentation plan would consist of a portfolio of water rights that you were saying you were going to dedicate to put in the stream in timing, place, and amount to replace any injurious depletions. And some of the municipalities have taken that argument to the point to where they're saying, you're injuring me 365 days a year, and I'm going to fight your augmentation plan. So you're going to have the lawyering to get through. But I can tell you, while this pain was going on in Water Division District 2 and 1, there were new wells going in down below. And I thought you were referring to this because it made people just crazy.
So this augmentation plan, would it be utilizing water rights in the alluvial aquifer?
It would be utilizing your surface water rights, your reservoir rights, an augmentation well, and free river rights. All of the above, depending on the complexity of your plan and the number of wells you were trying to cover under it.
But most of these augmentation plans, where do they get that augmentation water?
So the best plans have a mixture of all of the above, but they rely on free river conditions in the winter, okay? Because that's when
Divert and store.
you divert and store in the winter, and you lag your depletions back because that's when you're not buying that water. It's free river. The river's not under administration, okay?
Well, my point is they're getting the augmentation water and the water rights out of the same alluvial aquifer.
Or the surface system.
Or
It's a
Or trans basin, some
out
of
of
there's-
that system.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
So doesn't it come down to that if you want to drill a new well to use water out of that aquifer, you got to shut somebody else down?
Yeah, can we expand the pie? That's the question. So South Platte has a native flow of 1.4. There's about 0.4 million acre feet of transbasin. We have over 4 million acre feet of perfected water rights and probably twice that in conditional water rights. We're looking hard at new storage on the South Platte right now to see if we can capture some of those flood flows that are going to Nebraska. But short of that, it's a net zero sum game. It's hard to expand it. Great questions. I'm gonna hand the mic to
Keep
Cleve.
moving on.
Yep.
But before you leave, I did want to highlight in his lessons learned about rebalancing. So that's really what we're faced with, and the South Platte is ahead of us in that game in rebalancing. And then highlighting that it's not a static process, it's a dynamic process. But when I get up and talk, and I'll highlight where our histories diverge a little bit, and then our efforts to really rebalance our system. But we're not as far along as the South Platte is. So we'll see if Rio can pull mine up. There you go. And I'll use the same clicker that Regan was using.
It's the fake.
Toom. All right, and I appreciate Regan and his presentation. Again, I heard it at CU earlier this year, and I'm going to move a lot, Christy, so be challenged. And I learned something again today, so thanks, Regan. And again, it'll be I think it's an interesting comparison of how our basin developed. I'll do a little bit of the history first. So, again, I'm Cleve Simpson, the general manager of the Rio Grande Water Conservation District. I've been the manager for just over 2 years. And Reagan stole my line when Rio said she had a couple of water experts. I'm not a water expert. I'm very much a student of this. Been immersed in it really for the last 4 years, but grew up here farming and ranching and packing siphon tubes and canvas dams around. So I have an appreciation for what we're doing. I own a confined aquifer well. I own kind of junior surface water rights. My dad and I lease some places with what would normally be considered senior surface water rights that this year aren't flowing. Probably only twice in the last 100 years that those water rights weren't flowing. So that's a little bit of my background and makeup. So click. Just quickly, the basin represented in the state. The Division of Water Resources, it's outlined in red. The Rio Grande Water Conservation District would be a subset of that. It would be all the green inside the red, inside Conejos, Rio Grande Mineral, Saguache, and Alamosa counties. Costilla County is not part of the Rio Grande Water Conservation District. They chose that position 51 years ago, so the district's 50 years old. Click. And most of you know, just highlighting where some of the communities of interest here are in the valley. Click. This is a nice visual representation. I'm not sure how bad the glare is on the screen, but these are all the rivers and streams within the basin, and it really just jumps out to me about a couple of things, if I can make this pointer work. The lack of an abundance of surface water storage. Thank you, Rob. So if you look around the basin, it's labeled as lakes, but it could be reservoirs. You'll notice that it doesn't really jump out at you, but there's Rio Grande, Santa Maria, and Continental. Then there's really nothing else on the upper end of the San Juans, nothing in the Sangres. San Luis Lakes we don't actually use for irrigation, it's more for recreation. Smith Reservoir, Mountain Home, Sanchez. Here's an interesting spot. This is Cove Lake, which doesn't actually exist today, but did prior to, I don't know what year the dam was breached, and it hasn't been a lake since then, but prior to the compact when that Cove Lake was created. Lahara Reservoir and Platoro Reservoir. So again, not an abundance of available surface water storage, but you see all those streams, and where they end up is in the basin of this San Luis Valley, and what really creates our aquifer systems. And that's part of where we're unique from the South Platte. It's an alluvial system. We have a defined alluvial system really along the Rio Grande River, but outside of that, it's really created what we would call the closed basin, which are shallow, unconfined wells north of the river. And then under it and around the rest of the valley are a series of confined aquifer wells, deeper wells, artesian, that were really, people were drilling them in the early 1900s, but not generally for irrigation. They were mostly for stock water. But there are historical representations you'll see. I've seen a picture of a guy sitting on a horse getting a drink of water while he's sitting on his horse because the artesian pressure is high enough he can get a drink of water. There aren't very many of those wells. There isn't a well like that I know of anymore because of how the groundwater system has been developed. But I thought it was just a good visual representation. And then this just outlines some of the major streams and rivers that we deal with inside the Rio Grande. Next. Reagan talked about the development of the surface water system on the South Platte. We have the great privilege, I didn't represent it here, but we have the great privilege of the oldest water right in the state of Colorado. So it's on the Peoples Ditch just outside of San Luis. The Canea system started its development in the 1850s. And this just represents the canal systems, decreed canal systems on the Caneas. And we'll just advance this a decade at a time, and you'll see, here's the 1860s, there's a few more. Go ahead to the next one. The 1870s, you'll see a few more. 1880s, a few more, and I think there's one more present. So that's all the decreed surface water systems, diversions off of the Canea system that started in the 1850s, but by 1900, the system was over appropriated. There are way more water rights and water right applications on the Caneas, and we'll talk about the same thing on the Rio Grande, as there is water available. So that's an important note and distinction that we're highly over appropriated. The South Platte having a free river, we don't have a free river. We just never have a free river. Other thing to kind of take note of and watch, and Reagan talked about this a little bit, about return flows. So all these, especially the ones north of the Caneas, all flood irrigation. You know, this is an aerial photograph from recent, but historically in 1900, this was all flood irrigation. All those return flows from flood irrigation made it back to the Canea system at some point. And some of them were then picked up as somebody else's. A senior water rights return flow can become somebody else's, a junior water rights water right. So that's an important point to remember about the system and those return flows. Go to the next slide. So we'll do the same thing on the Rio Grande. The first ones were in the 1860s. One of them is the Silva Ditch. I don't know, Travis, do you know what the other two more senior ones might be? But Atencio. Same thing, we'll advance it. 1870s, you start seeing more. I think this is the Prairie Ditch, I believe. The next one, 1880s. You see how this just balloons, and you start seeing really big developments. This is the Commonwealth system, the Empire Canal. So that's what I farm off of. The Monte Vista Canal, the Rio Grande Canal, Farmers Union, the San Luis Valley Canal. So this is still just in the 1880s. I think there's one more, I believe. Yeah, this is called the New Ditch down on the, now it's the Alamos National Wildlife Refuge. So again, I think this is all the diversions at 1890, but again, much like the Caneas, highly over appropriated. Way more water rights and applications than there is water available. Continue taking water rights and issuing decrees on the Rio Grande into the 1930s and 40s, but those water rights are rarely, if ever, in priority anymore. And again, keep in mind, all flood irrigation. Return flows down here from the Monte Vista Canal and the Commonwealth. This whole system ends up acting a bit like a sponge, soaks all that up, and then you start seeing return flows back to the Rio Grande midway through the irrigation season. If Commonwealth and Monte Vista Canal have a good run, a good season, there is noticeable, measurable return flows back to the Rio Grande, result of that flood irrigation. The north side of this is unique though, in that it's a closed basin. So they recognize this even back in the early 1900s. All this surface water that we're diverting out here and flood irrigating does not return back to the Rio Grande. It's an isolated system. There's a measured hydrologic divide along the river that separates that. If the hydrologic divide is maintained, water diverted out here does not return back to the Rio Grande. It accumulates out here. And you can have an appreciation when we're flood irrigating. And the other thing, we'll talk about this in a minute, but there's this thing coming up called a compact. In 1900, we weren't administering the Rio Grande River for the compact. A compact is an agreement we have with New Mexico and Texas about how much water we're going to deliver to the river. So early on, we're not administering the river for compact. We're flood irrigating. I'll show you a graph. We had more water supply, just Mother Nature was providing more water. There was an abundance of water accumulated in what's called the sump of the valley. That'll come into play a little bit later on, but it's important to note and recognize it. You know, that those return flows on the north side weren't coming back to the Rio Grande. Click. Matter of fact, there was so much flood irrigation going on, we actually had to then create and install drainage systems. So everything in red are man-made drainage systems to handle tailwater from flood irrigation and or high groundwater levels to make it where you could actually be profitable and farm again. Well, the drains, so those return flows were just naturally happening when we started diverting out of the Rio Grande in 1860. As you got more and more of those diversions and higher flows, higher natural flows out of more snowpack in the mountains, the water table in these areas got so high. And when you're flood irrigating, you need a place to go a lot of times with your tailwater. So that's what kind of instituted the creation of these man-made drains. And some of them are simple surface drains out here in Carmel and Waverly and Norton and Bountiful and Bowen and San Luis Valley Canal. There was just a laundry list of drain systems to deal with, you know, artificially inflated high water tables and those tailings from flood irrigation. And some of them actually returned right back to the Rio Grande in a couple of places. And the other ones just continued to move water and dump it out in the sump area. See if there was anything else about this. Let's jump forward. So I touched on, this is a slide. I intended to talk a little bit about the compact. So we had all that surface water development from 1850 to 1910 and 20, and we're over appropriated. The states of New Mexico and Texas were concerned. They were pissed off because there wasn't as much water flowing into New Mexico as there was before. And it really got the federal government involved. And the federal government took the opportunity to organize a joint investigation team. So for 10 years, this joint investigation team studied the diversions, the irrigation practices, really from, it's called the Upper Rio Grande, but it's from Fort Quitman in Texas all the way to the headwaters. And out of this study, it really ended up with an equitable apportionment of the usable water out of the Rio Grande. So Colorado gets an apportionment, New Mexico gets an apportionment, and Texas gets one. Old Mexico's involved in this as well. So that's a new paradigm for the water users in so the investigation happened from 26 to 36. They developed a compact that had to be ratified by each state and then by the US Congress. Each of the states, Colorado ratified theirs in 1939, as did the US Congress. So effective in the irrigation season in 1939, there's now a new standard that says what flows in the Rio Grande and the Caneos is measured and gauged, and the state of Colorado owes a volume of water to the New Mexico state line. There was a couple of things in this slide, though. All the blue dots are diversions, but I threw this up here to highlight the yellow dots were the wells recorded during that joint investigation in 1936. So I think prepare yourself and hit the next slide. The next one's real visual, but this, nope, not yet. Oh, you ruined it. This has to do with the compact, and the compact really on the Rio Grande and the Caneos. So we gauge the flow in the Rio Grande at Del Norte and at Magoti, and then there's a scale that says, you know, based on what flows at Del Norte, the system owes so much to the state line, and it varies depending on how much flows at the Rio Grande. Low flows like this year, We don't owe very much. Matter of fact, so we also have a defined irrigation season in this basin. It's presumptively from April 1st through October 30th. That's the irrigation season. That's when we would be diverting water out of the Rio Grande. So from January through March, we're not diverting. That water's flowing to the state line and going towards our compact obligation. There was enough of a flow. There's so low flow in the Rio Grande and the Caneos this year that the flow here and here, just January through March, and then at the end of the irrigation season in November and December, will more than cover our obligation to New Mexico state line. I think I heard the division engineer say the other day, I think we'll actually exceed it by 13,000 acre feet. So anyway, that was the whole compact discussion plays into this interaction between groundwater and surface water, because effective in 1939, the state is expected to administer the river to cover that compact obligation. I didn't see anybody from the state in here, so I can talk bad about them. They didn't do a very good job of administering the river. Uh-oh, there's Matt. Sorry. They didn't do a great job of administering the river from 1939 to 69. The Rio Grande approached a deficit owed to the New Mexico state line of reportedly 1 million acre feet. That's a pretty significant deficit to overcome. We were taken to court. The state of Colorado was challenged by New Mexico and Texas to administer the river to the compact standards. Through an agreement out of the Supreme Court, Colorado said, okay, going forward, we'll administer and work to claw back that 1 million acre feet. So in 1969, administration on the river changed a little bit, changed significantly for water users on the Rio Grande. Now they started curtailing surface water guys that were due water, that in some instances have an 1860 water right. The state said, no, you can't divert because we got to pay compact. So that's an important thing to remember. That started in 1969, and it really comes into play after the next slide. The other way, there you go. So this is just a representation of all the decreed wells in Basin 3. So they're not all active. Some of them don't even exist. They're just decrees for wells, all the red ones. The yellow ones are what we would call a small capacity well. So those are 50 gallon a minute or less wells. But this tied into what Reagan was talking about, the build out of the electrical distribution system, and vertical turbine pump technology just exploded the development of groundwater. We built this, a culture and a community and a society here around irrigation on not a hugely dependable irrigation source called surface water. And it really led us to this development of groundwater wells. But that's just such a visual representation. Go forward one more, Rio. Now this is really just the current wells, but it's still massive. So there's 6,218 non-exempt wells in the basin. So those are generally irrigation wells, commercial wells, and municipal wells, roughly. And Reagan was talking about this in his discussion. So we didn't do all these in 1 year. They developed really from the 50s and 60s into the 70s. And that interaction between groundwater and surface water, the state, again, could tell and knew there was something happening, but they didn't have the ability to model and estimate what the impacts were to surface water systems. But there was enough of an impact. State issued a moratorium on those confined aquifer wells in 1972. They said, we don't exactly understand the interaction, but we know those wells are having an impact on return flows and compact obligation and senior water users. So they issued a moratorium in 72 on wells. Then the unconfined wells, look, there was a recognition within the next 10 years. There was also that same interaction between surface water and groundwater. The state then issued a moratorium on unconfined wells in the early 80s. The other thing to think about, Reagan talked about the gentleman's agreement between surface and groundwater in the South Platte. Although we didn't have a gentleman's agreement, I showed you all the water that ended up in the sump, the federal government, along with the Rio Grande Water Conservation District as a sponsor, developed the Closed Basin Project. The project's intent was to capture that water that's in the sump that was generally lost to evaporation or some native vegetation, rabbit brush and chicos. There was a project designed originally to deliver over a 10-year period, not to exceed 600,000 acre feet. So it was intended, thought there was enough water to deliver on average up to 60,000 acre feet a year. So our gentleman's agreement was if the wells are having an impact on the Rio Grande and the Canea system, we ought to be able to cover a portion of that, maybe in some instances all of it, with the Closed Basin Project. The project never delivered 60,000 acre feet in any one year. I think the highest year was about 40,000 acre feet. And really, as one of my later slides will show, again, the availability of water diminished to the point where now it does about 8,000 acre feet a year. So you couple that interaction between groundwater and surface water, no gentleman's agreement, no way to mitigate that injury, the worst drought in our recorded history in 2002, watching what happened on the South Platte, there was just a recognition in the Rio Grande Water Conservation District, we need a different outcome. We can't sustain our way of life here if state engineer comes in and issues cease and desist orders for 6,000 wells. So I think move forward when, talked a little bit earlier about how much flood irrigation was going on. Reagan touched on it a little bit. This is a map now of how we've transitioned nearly almost exclusively, that's not quite true, predominantly away from flood irrigation to sprinklers. So this is a map of 2014, just the number of center pivot irrigation sprinklers in the valley. So it's about 2,700. And that really happened over the course of from early 70s up to 2014, but most of them were probably in by late 90s, 2000, 2005. So you have a number of factors playing into this conversation, and transitioning from flood to sprinkler was one of them. Move forward, yeah. This was just an outline. I touched on the Closed Basin Project in the sump area. It's not without controversy, I assure you. Lots of emotion and dialogue about the Closed Basin Project, but it was intended to capture water, a water salvage project, 170 wells, shallow wells, that put water into an open canal and then deliver that water to the Rio Grande just across from the Alamosa National Wildlife Refuge. That's enough about the Closed Basin. I don't want to talk about it. Another topic, yeah, that's a whole topic in its own right. Just wanted to highlight, again, with that recognition and concern about surface water and groundwater, the district was really active since 1976 with a series of monitoring wells. So I have an employee, Chet's here tonight, I have an employee that goes out every month and measures about 100 wells, the water level in nearly 100 wells. And we've been doing that every month since January 1976. Move forward. So when the district watched what happened on the South Platte, again, we were anxious to look for a different alternative. We wanted a better opportunity to self-govern our outcome versus what happened on the South Platte. And the concept came forward of sub-districts underneath the Rio Grande Water Conservation District. So it's kind of set up as communities of interest. Certainly there are places where it doesn't always pan out, but it's kind of divided by types of wells. These are all generally unconfined wells. There are, I think, a couple hundred deep confined wells inside Subdistrict 1 as well. A small alluvial unconfined wells here. Anyway, the state developed these areas of common interest and allowed those areas then to pursue formation of sub-districts of the Rio Grande Water Conservation District that have their own groundwater management plans that are an alternative to Reagan's augmentation plans. They have to do the same thing. It's just a different mechanism to do it, and you do it collectively. Subdistrict 1 is about 3,000 wells, about 300 owners. They've been operating under this mode. This is their 8th year of operation, and I'll get just a minute to talk about their successes. But the other ones are in the process of evolving. Tomorrow we actually have a hearing for my board will consider adoption of the plan of water management for Subdistrict 2 and 3. So that means next year we'll have 3 sub-districts operational. They have to do the same thing Reagan talked about. We predict the injury that the wells cause, and the sub-district members have to replace that injury in time, location, and amount. They have to prove that to the state engineer every year, and then the state engineer says, okay, you can operate this year. Then you have to predict the injury, show your ability to mitigate the injury, you get to operate for that year. Uniquely for us, again, different from the South Platte, we're also obligated by legislation to create and maintain sustainable aquifers. That's a unique requirement. Nowhere else in the state is that well owners held to that standard. Yes and no. There's flexibility year to year, but the ultimate goal of where you have to get to, Subdistrict 1 is operating under a decree issued by the court that says in 20 years from their formation, they need to recover, I've got a graph that'll show you, but they've got a benchmark. They have to get their aquifer level from here to there. The confined aquifer systems by statute and by pending rules and regulations from the state have a benchmark that they have to get to. So there's a little flexibility of how you get from here to there, but where you have to get to is clearly well defined. That's certainly a consequence because they're operating under decree. If you don't live up to the decree, the court can tell the state engineer to red tag, cease and desist orders for all those wells. The rest of the wells that aren't under a decree yet, so the only one operating under a decree like that is Subdistrict 1. The others are in their formation process, but they're also operating knowing the state engineer for several years has worked towards establishing rules for groundwater withdrawals. And part of those rules say your well has to be either in a sub-district or have a court-approved augmentation plan that replaces your injury in time, location, and amount, and in most instances, create and maintain a sustainable aquifer. Frankie?
When do you anticipate the decree for the Alamos-Alahara sub-district of that happening? I know it's one of the later ones.
So it's one of the later ones. The court approved the formation of the sub-district in August. So that's a big milestone for us. So we're now to the point we have to get boards of managers. Long story short, they're probably operational in 2020. We would expect them to submit that document where you predict what your injury is and show the state you have the ability to mitigate the injury, and you're creating, maintaining a sustainable aquifer. It's called an annual replacement plan. Subdistrict 1's done 8 of them. The other 2 more will be doing it next year, and then the other 3 behind that immediately after that. Rio, go ahead and advance one. I'm really running out of time. This just represents the sub-districts that now have all been formed under the Rio Grande Water Conservation District. This was a visual representation. Everything in yellow is a property that's under a sub-district. What it doesn't include, I'm sorry, is the Trinchera. So again, there was a part here when I mentioned Costilla County not being part of the Rio Grande Water Conservation District. They are operating underneath the Trinchera Water Conservancy District, and I just don't have their data, but they're forming their own sub-district too. But I wanted to highlight, you can overlay that over most of the irrigated agriculture in the valley, and 95%, 98% of the irrigated land is now inside a sub-district with the creation of the last sub-district at the end of August. Forward. Try to wrap it up to leave some opportunity for questions. All the sub-districts are challenged. I touched on this a little bit earlier. We don't have the same supply of water that we have had historically. This is it's called a histogram. It shows every year since 1890 what the flow of the Rio Grande is at Del Norte. And the blue line is just a running historical average. So you can see the trend is downward. But was very visually stunning to me, and I've been trying to talk about really over the last month every chance I get. So we have 10 years, we're about to have a decade where the Rio Grande never hit, so this is 700,000 acre feet at Del Norte. We're about to have a decade where the Rio Grande doesn't hit 700,000. We've never had a decade in its history where it did that. But what's even more concerning to me is look at the 800,000 mark. So we're about to have 20 years of never having an 800,000 acre foot river on the Rio Grande. We don't even have a decade in our history that we didn't at least have one 800,000 acre feet, and most of them have 2 or 3 or more. So we're 20 years since 2002 of really, it's probably not even fair to call it a drought anymore. It's just climate. It's just where we're at in this. If it's a natural cycle or man-made, it's just where we're at. There's not a supply of water like we used to have. Maybe next one.
What do you expect in 2018 to show?
So this year we'll be right about here, 290. Is that right? Is that right, Matt? Is that right? Yeah. Just say yes. Yeah. No, it is. It'll be 290. So the implications of that 20-year dwindling supply is represented in this graph of the change of the unconfined aquifer. That's basically the aquifer north of the river. Subdistrict 1 lies over the top of quite a bit of this study area. The district, again, has been measuring and studying the aquifer since 1976. I've only put in here what the change was from '02, because prior to '02, it had some fluctuations, but it was fairly steady. In '02, this is a 400,000 acre foot decline in the volume of water in the study area of the unconfined aquifer. In a single year, we lost 400,000 acre feet. A little bit of a recovery, then drop, a little recovery, significant drop. The subdistrict came into operation. Its first year of operation was 2012. Our measurements, again, have shown what had better be the bottom of that change in storage in September of 2013. Since that time, Subdistrict 1, through a number of programs, CREP is a partnership with the federal government in the state of Colorado, following programs, incentives for conservation and efficiencies, a number of things the subdistrict has worked on to really move the bar up. So the subdistrict in that period had really recovered about 350,000 acre feet during times when the river was not great. Again, we didn't have a 700 or an 800,000 acre foot river, but it had 3 or 4 years where it was pretty close to average. So we made some significant progress. Then coming into this year, I mean, the writing was on the wall in April. We knew this was going to be challenging. I had every expectation that we would not lose 400,000 acre feet, but it was certainly feasible to think we would probably drop 200,000 acre feet out of the aquifer this year. Subdistrict doesn't pump as much as they did in 2004. They've been successful in cutting 100,000 acre feet out of their pumping since their existence, since they started their operations. They were doing the things to, again, put themselves in a better position. Mother Nature just really has not cooperated and really threw us a curveball that, again, we have a court order, we have a mandate to recover. We basically have to move that line back up to there. And we had 20 years to do it. We're in the 8th year of operation. We have 12 years left to really get aggressive and have an impact on our unconfined aquifer. The other subdistricts coming online, again, they'll have their own set of challenges to work with. I would highlight part of this discussion. I didn't focus on it enough. But much like the South Platte, you have to replace the injury that your wells caused to the river. So the subdistrict goes through the state's tools. They give us a tool to help predict what those injuries are in time, location, and amount. They've secured water. They store water. Then they release water when required to mitigate that injury. They've done an excellent job all 8 years of replacing the injury that their wells cause, in Subdistrict 1's case, just to the Rio Grande River. The aquifer is really challenging for the subdistrict. I put up on front here, this is just a map we did this year. It shows where we've taken the opportunity for CREP. Again, that's a fallowing program. We have partnership with the federal government. There's about 10,000 acres in CREP out of 160 or 70,000 irrigated acres in the subdistrict. They have their own fallowing program where they're not partnered with anybody. They just pay farmers not to farm, which is crazy. It's hard to get people who farm to incentivize them not to farm. They don't do it to not farm. They want to farm. It would be challenging for me to idle my farm. But look, something has to give. Anyway, there's a number of things represented here. There's also another thing, an insurance called Prevent Plant. It was just to highlight the efforts that we've gone through to try to work and move that line up, and we still suffered it'll end up being 200,000 acre feet decline this year. A significant challenge for the sub-district moving forward.
What impact would you say this is having on the surface water users, this decline?
Well, there's a modeled impact that, again, the state provides a tool for predicting what that is, and we just mitigate that. But I mean, there are bigger, I think I heard maybe Reagan talking about it, but you know, our systems support wildlife. It truly is a big sponge at times when we have enough water to divert and move that line up along the river corridors. The benefits are numerous. All the sub-districts, and our challenge is to get us back in balance. And again, Mother Nature isn't helping us. North of really Highway 50, conditions have been much better than they have been south of Highway 50 over the last several years. Us and the Southwest Basin and the Arkansas this year are, it's extreme drought conditions. And you could see it in all the runoff. A lot of the streams in the Sangre de Cristos just quit running. They didn't run at all. So pretty challenging. Yeah, Chris.
Quickly, and I know this is asking you to look into a crystal ball, just out of curiosity. If you're not able to replenish in the next 12 years to where the court's wanting you to be or wanting us to be, what are the potential consequences that the court could order on?
So if you didn't hear it, Chris asked about what if we don't close the gap in the next 12 years now? What are the consequences? The decree says we have to. If you don't live up to the decree, it allows the state engineer then to issue cease and desist orders for those wells. And that'll be the case. Well, look, if we're not making progress, you run the risk. Again, I mentioned every year we submit to the state a plan of how we're going to operate. You run the risk if he doesn't think progress is being made rapidly enough. I don't foresee that he has to wait 20 years to do that. He can tell you, look, you got 2 years to move that. If it continues to decline, he has the ability to force the issue earlier than later. I don't know whether he would, but those are the discussions we have. What are the consequences? How do we actively manage this? We are unique in that regard too, in that our aquifers do respond. We can manage them. The South Platte, the other basins in the state don't have that same level of responsiveness that we do. Yeah.
Would Colorado, though, if you're not able to replenish to where the court wanted to be, and you have the compacts with New Mexico, Texas, Mexico, do you think that we would still have to deliver the agreements under those compacts?
Yes, absolutely. So, and they're kind of, although they are connected, they're two distinct requirements. So the compact will get delivered if the state has to shut off. And they have to shut off every senior water user on the system. And that's what created a lot of the animosity. We put up there the Conneaus River was, those water rights are 1855. Even the time since I've been back in 4 years working in the district, I've seen them curtail, have to shut off every diversion in the Conneaus River system. But I own a well, and I can still pump my well. You talk about creating animosity, that's pretty I mean, that guy has an 1850 water right, and we got to turn him off.
Yeah, compare that to the South Platte, where we got a 1.8 million acre foot run, and we have 1.8 million acre feet of storage. Colorado River, think of the storage on that system. You guys are storage short.
Yeah, our storage is our aquifer. And
Have alluvial storage projects been proposed for the Rio Grande?
so there is one pending case about taking much like what happened on the South Platte, take your surface water diversion, you end up drying up the irrigated acres for it, You store it in a reservoir that has a engineered release of when you store that water there, when does it show up into the river? So I think I can only think of one. And again, when you're talking about building storage here, it gets really, really complicated. The compact has some articles in it about what you do with water storage vessels created after the compact. There's only really one, I think. Platoro is the only water storage vessel that we have that was created after the compact.
Cleve, I might mention what happened on the Arkansas River. That squabble between Kansas and Arkansas was all about the development of groundwater. I mean, not all, but mostly. And there was, to this man's question about the compact, there was no doubt the compact trumped, and those wells went down.
A lot of the conversation was about the conservation of the water, but it should come sort of be about the lack thereof.
Supply.
The supply, yeah. So there's no snow coming down, and that's been historically our storage is the snowpack. So me, being a negative person, so you don't see the snowpack getting higher in the future because the climate is changing and getting hotter. So why aren't we talking more about climate change versus how we can save water that we don't have?
So, and those conversations are happening. We're actually going through an exercise right now. So the basin, and I'll put a plug in for something called the Rio Grande Basin Roundtable. So on a monthly basis, and it's open to the public, but water users across the valley meet to talk about any number of issues. But one thing we're working on right now is sitting down and go, what is the supply of water do we think is available for the next 10 years, and what are the consequences of a dwindling water supply? So I mentioned we have about 500,000 irrigated acres in the valley. This is only not the Rio Grande Water Conservation District, just me, thinking there's somewhere between 100,000 to 150,000 irrigated acres that can't be supported. You take a dwindling water supply, you take a diminishing aquifer supply, and requirements to recover them. Unless we find a crop that's half the consumptive use of what we're growing now, we're really challenged. And I mean, there are consequences, social consequences to taking 100,000 acres out of production in the valley. But again, it's me. That's a reality. I think we have to start having those more conversations. Where do I go? Christy hasn't.
So I have been doing work both here and in the South Platte, and I think it's important to highlight, to piggyback off your question, how have you seen the positive response of irrigators, whether that's alternative crop types or maybe leasing water to municipalities, or like, what are they doing? What is happening?
Well, so in the Rio Grande Basin, again, the only one that's really been forced to do something is Subdistrict 1 because they're operating under decree. So again, they cut 100,000 acre feet of pumping out. Some of that is because there wasn't a supply of water. And those diminishing aquifers, some people just didn't have water to pump anymore. But there are conservation efforts, different crop types, different rotations. Again, the fallowing programs that we've supported, the sub-district has put forward out of their own pockets over the last 7 years, $8 million towards fallowing projects. They've put $6 million towards acquisition, to actually buying groundwater irrigated parcels and stop irrigating them. So those are some of the things, at least, that have been happening on the Rio Grande.
South Platte's really different, as you know. And one of the really big differences that I think needs to be pointed out, this is an agriculturally dependent community. Look at your economy here. This community is about agriculture. South Platte doesn't even skip a beat when the next 10,000 acres go out of production, right? We got oil and gas, we got growth, we got, commerce. It's different here. And, you guys need to think about that as a community, what your future looks like.
Patrick.
Is there a way of making the pain equally distributed?
What did he say?
Is there a way to make the pain equally distributed?
Share the pain.
So the sub-districts,
Instead of having absolute winners and losers or communities that just die.
well, there's a way to share the pain within each sub-district. They all structured their plans independently. Sub-District 1, again, laid the groundwork 10 years ago what theirs looked like, and they thought they could do this through economic decisions by producers, and really about CREP. Am I at a point in my career maybe, and I don't have siblings that want to inherit the farm rather than sell it? There is a pretty good incentive to put it in CREP. Some of the other sub-districts have written language in their plans that said potentially maybe there's an across-the-board 10% reduction in groundwater withdrawals. So everybody just took a slightly different approach to it. And look, it's a social experiment of how we know what we have to do. The challenge is how do we get there? And each of the sub-districts will be on a time frame to get to their end game. So I get calls routinely from researchers across the country wanting to know how we set it up, how it's working, how the other sub-districts are going to work. It's a difficult process.
Does the compact change at all, or is this still based on the original compact? And are they hurting as bad further south as we are up here?
Yes. So the compact itself doesn't change, but on an annual basis, the volume that we owe changes based on how much flows at Del Norte and Magoti. And downstream users are certainly, the Rio Grande Basin is a basin of diminishing returns right now from here to Fort Quitman. There's not the same supply of water. We don't see the huge municipal demand here in the San Luis Valley, but I assure you in the middle Rio Grande with Santa Fe and Albuquerque, El Paso, Las Cruces, they have growing demands, and much of those demands are filled by groundwater and the impacts they have on the river. You have endangered species to consider. There's a Rio Grande silvery minnow in the middle reach of the Rio Grande that's this year I saw TV coverage of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employees scooping up the last remnants of some of those endangered species to get them transplanted because the river was dry except for puddles of water. Again, this is a challenge. There is always conversation, can we go back and renegotiate the compact? No. The short answer is absolutely not. It's an equitable apportionment, and if you're going to renegotiate the compact, who's going to give up their equal apportionment? I can assure you Colorado's not going to give up. Texas and New Mexico are not going to give up. So I can't see that happening.